So the next steps are, upon board adoption, the regulation digest is submitted to the Office of Administrative Law, or OAL, for approval. The public may submit comments to OAL for 5 calendar days after the regulation digest is submitted to OAL, and OAL has up to 10 calendar days to review the regulation. It is anticipated that if adopted by the State Water Board and approved by OAL, the regulation will go into effect at the beginning of July. We anticipate on the 3rd, but it is not possible to say with certainty as OAL may approve the regulation sooner. As summer continues, the State Water Board will work with CDFW and NIMS to determine if connectivity between pools is being maintained. If connectivity continues to decrease, it may be necessary for the State Water Board to issue curtailments or pursue other measures. If the regulation is adopted by the board, State Water Board staff will hold outreach meetings regarding the emergency regulation, during which staff will explain requirements and field questions regarding the emergency regulation. The first meeting is scheduled for Monday, July 6th from 6 to 9 p.m. at Salmon Creek School in Occidental. The second is on Tuesday, July 7th from 6 to 9 p.m. at the Healdsburg City Council Chambers. The third is on Wednesday, July 8th from 6 to 9 p.m. at the Forestville Fire Department in Forestville. The last meetings will be held on Thursday, July 9th from 1 to 4 p.m. and 6 to 9 p.m. at the North Coast Regional Water Board. Additional information on the outreach sessions will be posted on the Russian River Tributaries Emergency Regulation webpage and emailed to the Russian River email list. This slide provides information on the emergency regulation resources. The webpage will be updated throughout the year. The webpage includes additional resources and contact information. Interested parties can sign up on the Russian River Tributaries Emergency Regulation email list to receive drought notices and updates regarding curtailments and announcements related to this emergency regulation. For more information on the proposed emergency regulation, State Water Board staff may be reached by telephone at 916-322-8422 or by email at rr_tribs_emergency_reg@waterboards.ca.gov. State Water Board staff recommends adopting this emergency regulation with change sheet number 2. This concludes my presentation. We can take questions at this time or after the fishery agencies have provided their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Just a quick question, and I know we're eager to go to the fisheries presentation, but one of the questions that came up in some of the comments, and it's a logical question, is the distinction between homeowners and vineyards. I know those aren't the only two players in the whole valley, but that's the dynamic in the dialogue. So can you explain that distinction, that essentially the conservation order applies to equally to home, it applies to everybody, and I hope to have the conservation order yield benefits, and then if we did curtailments, if it's not adequate at those low flow, if we do curtailments, which we might have to do absent the fish too later in the season, the information order will give us the info we need to do curtailments the way we have to do curtailments, because the curtailments apply to everybody withdrawing water in the watershed, but we don't have enough information to be able to do it. So it's both processes apply equally to all water users on a watershed, which is kind of the normal way to do things, right?
Yeah, you summarized it exactly correctly. The enhanced conservation measures apply to all water users all water users of water sourced from in the 4 watersheds. So if you have ornamental turf, a lawn, you cannot water it if you are getting water from within those 4 watersheds. Additionally, you couldn't water non-agricultural, if you have non-agricultural, commercial agricultural trees, you could water them up to 2 days per week from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. under this regulation. This regulation does recognize that there is commercial agriculture in those 4 watersheds and does not put those same prohibitions and limitations on commercial agriculture. Same with the informational order. The informational order applies to all landowners within the 4 watersheds equally. There's no distinction between whether there's ag or domestic or any other type of water use relative to those informational orders. And the informational order is essential in terms of being able to understand which landowners have wells and surface diversions are, but hydraulically connected to the stream. So that if we were to need to proceed with curtailments this year, or should the drought persist in a future year, we would have appropriate information to be able to pursue the priority system appropriately.
So I think that this gets to an issue of education, because there seems to be maybe a sense by some that ag is not doing its fair share. And there are a number of, although the conservation order does not apply to agricultural crops. So I think it's an issue of just sort of threading the needle on education and outreach, explaining that, from what I understand, in those 4 watersheds, either the majority or as much as 2/3, I don't know what the amount is, but most of it is residential, rural residential use. And I'm not seeing that in any of the materials. You may have it in some materials, but I haven't seen it in anything so far. So I think it would be helpful to get the word out. And then also on the voluntary drought initiatives, probably the most significant initiatives are those taken by 2 wineries that have provided for a significant amount of diversions. And so helping to get that information out. And I think the main reason for the need for that is that folks need to feel that they're in this together. And if there's a sense of unfairness, then we're going to have a problem with compliance.
Yes, CDFW will be touching on why we're looking at the ornamental turf side of things with respect to these 4 watersheds specifically. I believe their presentation will also focus on some of the other efforts that they're working on with landowners in the area, specifically ag, to provide pulses of water potentially later in the summer that would benefit the fisheries, as well as at least one winery who's put forth money to allow landowners to put on off-stream storage and provide grant funds for landowners to do so.
Right. And then if you all could take a look at resolution item number 13, not to wordsmith it now, but just if you could take a look at it and maybe comment later on any way to use that resolution item number to include maybe a little more information on rural residential diversions. You know, if it's the majority or 2/3 or, you know, some way to describe it so that, you know, it helps getting the information out. Although I don't think a lot of people are going to look at the resolution. I think more importantly would be the education and outreach materials on that.
Recognizing that's preliminary in our understanding, because hence the need for the informational order, but that is a significant part of the diversions and the watersheds. Thank you, Board Member Diadama, for pointing out what I think are some fairly extraordinary voluntary efforts that are going on that we've learned about in meeting with folks in the watershed. And so we want to recognize that the regulatory framework is kind of more of a defensive framework by its very nature, but we don't want to lose track of the importance of recognizing folks who kind of go more on offense in their voluntary capacity to make a big difference for the fishery resource. So we've got to thread that needle as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's turn to Fish and Wildlife. Hello, fish people.
Ernie's saying I have to sit next to her. I'll figure this out as we go. Good morning, Chairman Marcus and fellow board members. My name is Eric Larson. I'm the Fishery Program Manager for the Bay Delta region of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'll be giving you a brief overview of the setting, which actually Dan did a tremendous job sort of laying out the watershed issues and the micro watersheds, the priority watersheds that we're looking at. but I'll sort of touch on that again just briefly. And then I will be providing you an overview of the fisheries of concern in regards to the proposed action, including information about the multi-agency Coho recovery broodstock program and other actions that CDF has taken to protect and restore salmon habitat or salmonid habitat in the Russian River Basin, and in particular for the primary watersheds that this proposed action is addressing. So let's try the first button here. Okay, that didn't work. There we go. So this was a map you saw earlier, and this is proposed emergency action before you. Focuses on the 4 watersheds within the Russian River Basin in Sonoma County. These watersheds are Mill Creek, Mark West Creek, Green Valley Creek, and Dutchbill Creek, and they've been identified by California Department of Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service as primary watersheds within the Russian River Basin for the preservation of federally listed and state-listed salmonid species. As you probably are aware, Mill Creek is a tributary to Dry Creek, which flows to the Russian River near the city of Healdsburg. Mark West Creek, which drains the western slope of the Mayacamba Mountains east of Santa Rosa and drains directly to the Russian River below the Laguna de Santa Rosa. And Green Valley Creek, which flows to Atascadero Creek and then the Russian River near Forestville. And Dutchville Creek, which drains the eastern slope of the coastal range near Occidental and flows directly to the Russian River at Monte Rio. Within these 4 watersheds, I got to back up. Within these 4 watersheds, California Department of Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife, and NIMFS have identified key reaches that have historically remained wetted throughout the summer months. These reaches are depicted on the slide as reaches of interest, and my colleagues will be getting more into that as we finish our presentation. However, it's important to note that these reaches, important reaches within these priority watersheds were selected because they have historically remained wet, even during dry years and in previous drought years. So these are the areas where habitat have remained through summer months that support salmonid species. The 3 salmonid species utilizing the Russian River Basin for critical phases of their life history include coastal Chinook salmon, which was listed by the federal government as endangered species, listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. And this species utilizes the main stem primarily of the Russian River and is therefore not a focus of this particular action because it doesn't use the tributaries, although we do find the offspring in the tributaries at times. It's not their critical habitat area. The 2 species for this action focus on the Central Coast Coho and Steelhead populations, both referred to as CCC Coho and CCC Steelhead. Both these species are also listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, Coho as endangered and Steelhead as threatened. And in 2002, the Central Coast Coho population was listed by California as endangered under our own Endangered Species Act. Recovery plans for Coho were developed by the state in 2004 and by NIMFS in 2014. So that's the federal and the state. Salmonids have a unique life history. All 3 salmonid species that I mentioned earlier are anadromous species, which means that they spawn in freshwater. And I realize this is pretty basic, but it kind of gets to some of the points that I'm going to be making, and live a portion of their lives in the ocean, and then return to the waters of their natal origin for reproduction purposes to spawn. Again, I'm primarily going to focus on Coho salmon and steelhead trout, which have similar life history strategies. Offspring stay in the waters of origin for the first year of their life. And that's different from Chinook, again, not our primary focus in this particular regulation. They need to be in a stream and have sufficient water and good water quality for a whole year of their life, right? Unlike the important life stage that this emergency regulation action will address is the fry stage, otherwise known as young of the year. Both Coho salmon and steelhead trout are dependent on suitable summer rearing habitat for the first year of their life. This includes cold, clear, slow-moving water, sufficient dissolved oxygen, and enough habitat to provide food source. I also want to emphasize the importance of the Russian River in regards to the recovery of Coho salmon. Historically, the Russian River Basin had over 30 tributaries that supported Coho salmon. This historic production is the most significant contributing population source within what is known as the Central Coast ESU, or Evolutionary Significant Unit. ESUs are how we genetically distinguish populations of salmon, the overall salmon population on the West Coast. California has 3 of them, as illustrated in this slide. Simply put, without the Russian River, Coho salmon population production within the ESU, CCC ESU, would not exist. In fact, the Central Coast ESU would likely not exist if Coho population within the Russian River became extirpated. It is of critical importance that this population is recovered. Again, it is cold, clear, flowing water that is needed to maintain Coho and Steelhead over summer months throughout the year. This habitat type is best met in stream channels that are with connected pools that provide habitat areas that need to be protected within the 4 primary watersheds identified in the emergency regulation. And I'll get into why these primary watersheds, or why these watersheds were selected. Coho and steelhead fry that this habitat provides will develop into smolts that are ready for winter rains and will move out to the ocean in late spring to early summer during the 2nd year of their life. As mentioned earlier, steelhead have a somewhat different characteristics in that they continue to move downstream and will rear within the Russian River. One of the areas that they are in area at the lower portion of the Russian River. Food is provided for them in that location. Thank you. All right. I keep lifting my head. While CDF and CDFW has and will continue to conduct fish rescues throughout the tributaries of the Russian River, including the 4 primary watersheds we've identified, as well as other coastal watersheds throughout our region, fish rescues are not the answer to the current crisis. Fish rescues are difficult, they're labor intensive, at times impractical, and often require access permission from private landowners that sometimes can be difficult to achieve. Further, fish rescues only work when they are conducted in a timely manner and there's sufficient habitat to put the rescued fish into. Existing habitats that do support fish often already have fish in them, and so that does not provide for an area for fish to be moved into as it overcompetes the site. Also, as we've seen in the past few years of this current drought cycle, when there are pools begin to drying and we need to conduct fish rescues, it's occurring throughout the entire watershed, and we end up with very, very little habitat to move fish into. So for those reasons, and as well as the risks of moving the fish themselves, fish rescues are the last resort that we take in our actions. I also wanted to briefly touch upon our broodstock program, and this is significant because it sort of illustrates why the 4 watersheds that we've picked are so important. The proposed emergency regulation action before you is not happening in a vacuum. Since 2001, California Department of Fish and Wildlife and others have worked together to, including interest groups outside of the agencies, to manage and run a captive broodstock program for Coho salmon in the Russian River Basin. This drastic action was undertaken to prevent the extirpation of Coho salmon from the watershed, particularly in light of our understanding of the Russian River's contribution to the overall survival of Coho salmon within the entire CCC, ESU. Beginning in 2001, 3 successive year classes of wild coho were collected from the Russian River tributaries. This initial broodstock collection represents the last remaining coho in the Russian River Basin. Not surprisingly, Green Valley Creek, Dutchbill Creek, now identified as 2 of the primary watersheds in our voluntary drought initiative, and included in these proposed regulation actions, was the location of the last remaining wild coho. As I mentioned previously, multi-agency Russian River coho broodstock program was started because of significant decline in the coho salmon population within the Russian River watershed. As this slide depicts, it is believed that there were approximately 32 streams within the Russian River that historically supported coho salmon. However, since the mid-90s, the population has been on a serious downward path. Between 1995 and 1997, 15 of the 21 sampled streams, approximately 70% of the streams that had coho originally, had decreased in their population. By 1998 through 2000, the distribution decreased to only 50% of the streams. An increased sampling effort then began occurring in 2001 to 2003 as part of our Broodstock program, revealing that the situation for coho was even more dire. Only 5 of the 22 sampled streams had coho remaining, and only 1 of the 5 streams contained 3 consecutive year classes. That was Green Valley Creek. In 2008, none of the streams that contained coho salmon between 2001 through 2003 had seen any returns at all. And I think that this slide will probably help a little bit. It's similar to the slide that Dan put up, but it gives you a little bit more information. And the good news is that in relative terms, the Russian River coho population has improved because of the Broodstock program. After 10 years, we began to see some returns to the tributaries. And I need to point out that when we talk about wild returns, we're talking about everything that was produced out of the Broodstock program. Those are not hatchery fish per se. Those are fish that were rescued from the wild, put into a captive rearing program. A particular spawning matrix was developed to keep their genetic diversity. Introduction of stray genetics were put in. So we're trying to mimic nature. And when we release the fish, we don't release them from the hatchery, we release them into the tributaries of the Russian River. And that microphone? Okay. And so that when we start counting these fish, what we're really counting is the wild stock again. And what you have in our graph is our direct counts, as you can see from 2009 and 10 on up, our direct counts. And because we've tagged these fish and we're able to monitor these fish, we're able to extrapolate an expansion number to estimate what the population actually is that is returning. The blue line on this graph illustrates the juvenile releases. And as you can see, too, we've increased our production. We're at about 200,000 offspring per year that we're putting out into the wild. We're not anywhere near recovery. You know, this graph, again, in relative terms, we're talking about 600 fish in the brood year 2012-13, as opposed to about 9,000 is what we'd really like to see as far as recovery. So we're starting. We've had some roadblocks and we've had some stumbling blocks. And what you can see beginning in 2013 and 2013 through 14 and 14 through 15 is we've dropped back down again in our wild stock return. It's not all attributed directly to the drought. However, the drought certainly has a significant impact to that. There's other reasons. Again, correlation is not necessarily causation, but we are seeing, you know, dramatic decline in the population associated with habitat loss, and that habitat loss is also water.
I guess I have why starting the Broodstock program was critical, is very important, but there were quite a number of years when the numbers were going down, but there was no Broodstock program. You know, part of the challenge that we're addressing now is that this is kind of a surprise to people who have lived in this area. They haven't really thought they had that they were needed to be helping on this. And you know, I'm glad we're here, and I'm glad we're moving forward. But is there any reason why we didn't move forward earlier, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago? I mean, it just looks to me like the danger signs were there, and it would have helped to build community support for this if we had started earlier rather than, you know, when it's such an emergency.
And do you mean started the Broodstock program earlier?
No, just started engaging the community in maintaining their streams, such that at least there was some connectivity, if you will, from pools. I don't know. That just leaps out at me. Again, it's not your fault because you're relatively, you're here now, but it is a lesson for the future. I mean, we just cannot wait to the last minute. It doesn't work very well. It makes people very mad.
I have maybe a variation on that. I think if you go out in the watershed, you'll see that landowners and farmers, here and there are really proud of the actions that they have taken, collaborative efforts working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and with RCD. So my question would be more along the lines of building on what's out there. There does seem to be an issue of distrust. I think that's, typical anyway, distrust of regulators, but there may have been steps in the past with some field staff, and so people remember that. And so I think, again, the quickest way is to work, building the local partnerships. Fish and Wildlife, State Board, bringing in CDFA as well, working with the local partners.
Yeah, I'll mention a couple things as they get more into this, and that's some of the money that we've put into habitat restoration in addition to the Broodstock program. It wasn't really until the 1990s that the agencies began to recognize the rapid decline of the fish populations, Salmonid populations in California. And those were the time periods where listing petitions came in, the early 2000s when Coho was listed itself. And my agency, other fish agencies, didn't know a lot about Coho themselves. I mean, it's surprising what we didn't know. And the Russian River is an incredibly complicated basin to work in. It's a water conveyance system. There's 2 dams that control the water on the Russian River out of Lake Mendocino and Lake Sonoma. And there's a Potter Valley project which provides water through the hill from Lake Pillsbury, which had artificially increased the flow in water in the Russian River for well over 100 years at this point. So things had changed, habitat had changed, and the impact of those changes weren't really seen on the population. Certainly there were old timers that will, tell you stories of fishing stories or walking across the backs of fish. But it wasn't until no fish were seen that people started really saying, what's going on? What's changed here? And that's when the Broodstock, literally, we were monitoring the population through the late 90s. And when we hit what we believed was the last viable 300 fish production in the system, we said we have to do something now, and there really wasn't an option. Creating a Broodstock program, taking fish out of the wild and doing that kind of program is a very dramatic effort that had never really been done previously. So, yeah.
I appreciate the discussion. It shows the investment, the extraordinary investment and effort to try to do this. When I wanted to make sure I was clear. You noted that you were transporting in fish rescue the steelhead to the main stem because that's maybe part of their natural rearing area. But is that problematic for the Coho and the Broodstock program? Is there a mortality you're concerned about by going into the main stem?
Any fish rescue, there's a concern for mortality. The real issue is once you've done a fish rescue, it's very difficult to monitor what happens to those fish over time. With the Broodstock program, we actually have what we call pit tags, passive the transmitters that we can monitor through an array of antennas, and so we can keep track of many of the fish that we've moved around. This year, because of concerns about lack of habitat, if we're finding young in the air coho, we're taking those to the hatchery. One of the things that we need within the Broodstock program is to introduce the genetics of fish that have been to the ocean and back. So we have a need to collect about 300 of those fish a year. And so that's presently, we're below that at this point. We're still collecting those fish. With steelhead, because there's an ability for them to survive in the main stem and to rear in the estuary and lagoon down at the lower portion of the Russian River, we're releasing those fish from where they would surely die if the pools dried up into areas where they could rear along the main stem. Our primary focus thus far this particular year is in disconnected streams that have already become disconnected from the main stem, in moving the smolts that are ready to move downstream into waters where they are able to then access the ocean through the main stem.
That's for the steelhead.
Steelhead and coho.
And coho.
Yeah.
Both, okay. But
Those are fish that are ready to move to the ocean.
Right, they're the smolts as opposed to the young of the year, which you're taking to the broodstock program. Yep.
As we get it further into the season, a slide was shown earlier that sort of depicted what we were seeing in the wild in the summer months and then September, and how pools are becoming disconnected over time. What we've seen during the drought period is that pools that are disconnected and in low quality habitat in September, by October are dry and there's no fish remaining. So in areas where we're able to move fish, or we're identifying pools that may be sustained that we can put fish into, we'll do that. If not, then we'll take those to the hatchery and then put them back into their waters of origin. We're able to segregate and keep them separate, put them back into the waters of origin when rains return.
It can be a lot of effort to mimic nature, but worth it.
So in addition to the Coho Broodstock program, the department operates what's known as the Fishery Restoration Grant Program. And over $4.5 million in coho and salmon and steelhead habitat projects have been invested within the 4 primary watersheds alone. You add in cost share of other agencies, organizations, landowners, and that value more than doubles. Examples of the Fishery Restoration Grant Program projects include in-stream habitat restoration, barrier removals, installation of large woody material, road improvements to reduce sediment inputs, stream storage, water storage containment, and improvements for frost protection methodology, irrigation efficiency projects that dramatically reduce stream water dependency. But of course, the elephant in the ecosystem, and I realized when I sort of came up with that there may actually be elephants in the ecosystem at Safari West, so that would be on the Mark West Creek watershed, so that's probably not a good analogy, but is water. And the one thing that we've worked on incrementally, but it's a small piece of the overall fishery restoration grant funds, is to try to keep water within the streams. And we're there now where we have a recognition of that importance, and the droughts really brought that on. In addition, the Russian River Watershed Resources Partnership, and funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, focuses on these 4 sub-watersheds because they have the greatest potential for stream flow enhancement and coho recovery. There's also substantial and valuable investments in these 4 primary watersheds outside of the resources agencies, including the Sonoma RCD, Gold Ridge RCD, Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and other organizations that have been instrumental in bringing grant funding and technical support and capacity building to these 4 primary watersheds. And thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can wait until my department's finished.
A couple of questions. So could you provide some information about physical solutions, projects, habitat projects, aside from flow, habitat projects that you could implement, if not this year, even for planning into the future? This isn't the last year we're going to be looking at this. I've heard from a number of people in these watersheds indicating that they had projects, that they were working with CDFW, but that they didn't find the terms good enough for them to, have the incentive to continue, specifically ESA protection.
Well, right. I mean, there's projects annually that are under the Fishery Restoration Grant Program, and those programs are permitted through that grant cycle. So folks that come in under the FRGP there's a cost share involved, so there's either local entities that are involved or landowners themselves, and then the government funds are picked up for a portion of that as well. Those projects are permitted through CEQA and permitted for coverage of the take of listed species, and they work with Department of Fish and Wildlife and NIMS on those projects to ensure that they're done in the best way. There's other actions that could be taken by individual landowners or interest groups that are interested in putting money in, but the permitting process is a little more lengthy as opposed to a one-year permitting cycle. There's a one-year bid cycle and a one-year permitting cycle that goes into that with a 6-year implementation under the FRGP. The permits need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, which requires staff time and different focuses, whether it be the stream bed alteration agreement or the take permit, and producing a CEQA document. So at times, there'll be projects, bridge work, culvert work that come in that have mitigation associated with it, and those impacts can be rolled into that permitting process. But it is a rather onerous process just to take a restoration project itself outside of the established programs and try to permit them.
Do you have any pending in these 4 watersheds?
Yeah, there's within these 4 watersheds, there's 3 that were approved last year, FRGP projects that were approved, and they're going through a process now of writing up the documentation to support those. There was also during this current cycle, there's projects as well that are now being field reviewed for their for approval that will come up later on this summer.
And so if it doesn't fall under the FRGP, could that be because of limited funding, or would it necessarily mean that it doesn't make the cut as a priority project?
Even projects that come in under the FRGP, right now the FRG is focused primarily on coho habitat restoration, and so projects that come in that are focusing on steelhead, for example, are not necessarily rated as high unless there's benefits to coho within those projects as well. There's projects that have been implemented under the biological opinion, which was developed by National Marine Fisheries Service for the operation of the Russian River system by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Sonoma County Water Agency. And there were certain requirements that came out of that, RPAs, that had habitat restoration projects associated with it in the tributaries, Mill Creek being one of them, and those projects have been completed. So there's projects that do happen outside of the FRGP, but it's usually if it comes with either mitigation requirement or funding from some other source.
And the next question that I had was on the voluntary agreements. I was on a call earlier this morning with the RCDs and Sonoma County and CDFA, and it was brought up that by one of the RCDs that the voluntary drought initiative agreements, have access. All of them have access, correct? And that their sense was that, knowing the community because they're on the ground, their sense was that you could probably get more of those agreements signed if you did not have access. And I recognize that in order to qualify for an exemption under the conservation order, that's an essential component. But perhaps there could be 2 voluntary agreements, one with and one without. And then if you have the access, that would qualify you for an exemption under the conservation order. Otherwise, for those that want to show that they're conserving and checking the boxes on some of the BMPs, that there would be another route for them to take through a more formal, voluntary drought initiative. Is that something you'd be open to?
Well, we talked a lot about this because we knew that access is a real sticking point for many landowners. The problem for us is that we don't need access. Personally, I don't need access. I'm a fish biologist. I don't need access to somebody's property. I need access to the stream. We need to be able to conduct monitoring. We need to be able to walk up the stream to the various pools. And if we don't have access to do that, if we're blocked off in a certain segment, then our monitoring efforts are stifled. We have to get out of the stream, walk around that property, go back in again. So we decided under the process of developing these VDI protocols is that access was of critical need for us to be able to get in there and do rescues and to monitor what's going on. And for us, from the fish biology perspective, it's not monitoring whether somebody's complying with the terms of the VDI and not watering their lawn, at least from my perspective. It's what is the effect on the stream? Are we seeing more water in the stream? Are we seeing the habitat improved? Are we seeing cooler temperatures maintained and a flow between the pools? And we can't do that unless we have access. So I understand that point of view, and the RCDs have approached me as well with that statement. It's just from a biological perspective, from a monitoring perspective, if we don't have access, we don't know what's going on. We're not able to. There's stretches you'll see in some of our maps. You see, green, blue lines, and then you'll see a gray portion, and that's because we have absolutely no access to that portion of the stream and no idea what's going on. We don't know how many fish are there. We don't know if there's pools there, let alone diversion. So for us, access is critical.
So what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking that, it takes a while to build trust, and that if landowners are open to entering into a voluntary agreement with an agency that maybe they're not real comfortable with, but this gets them, incrementally closer to the voluntary agreement that is preferred. And so now would not be the time, to negotiate all of this. I would just say that in the discussion that I had, and this is for State Water Board staff as well, the discussion that I had earlier this morning, there were a lot of really good ideas, a lot of interest by local entities to be more engaged and to partner with us. And so I'll be following up with Director Bonham. I think Karen Ross will too, with the idea of improved coordination with the local entities and trying to get maybe a higher level of engagement. James Gore, Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, was on the call, and he said that they have a regional partnership program with their RCDs, and they'd like to integrate their process with what we're doing and try and coordinate on message, and then maybe build on some of the ideas that they have for voluntary agreements along the lines of what I was just talking about, and also be looking at big picture beyond this year. Because they do recognize that we're all not going to go away, and I think Board Member Spivey, Weber was correct in saying, how come this hasn't been done sooner? This is a problem that's going to continue. So just trying to do everything we can to collaborate more with the locals, and along those lines, the let's see here the emergency regulation outreach meetings. So these 4 meetings coming up, it'd be great if we could have that collaborative discussion beforehand, because I understand that the meetings that the department had organized were not very well attended. And so the RCDs had a lot of really good ideas about how to get folks engaged. And, we may not know because we're not out on the ground. The meeting that I attended last Friday that the Sonoma County Wine Grape Grower Commission put together was well attended. There were 450 people there. So that was a tremendous opportunity that Andrew and I had to work on message.
If I may, the one thing I'll just say about the whole issue of access and concerns in regards to landowners. My folks that are going out are not fish and wildlife wardens. They're not. We're not enforcement staff. So we have always had a policy within the Fishery Restoration Grant Program and our monitoring program that we're there to do a job, and we're not there to make notations about what somebody is doing legally. So, we will maintain that same sort of principle as we get into this.
Is that fine? Do you have any language in the voluntary agreements to that effect? Because maybe that would be a way to upfront be clear about what the expectation.
No, we don't at this time. We're open to tweaks to the voluntary agreement as this goes forward. Again, meeting the floor of the regulations and possibly tweaking it as we go on and build some trust.
A follow-up meeting in everyone's future. You should state your name for the record.
Nancy Murray, thank you.
So just to get back to Board Member Diodamo's comment about the RCDs, in terms of setting up the outreach meetings in the week of July 6th, we have been coordinating with the RCDs within the area, and they have been very helpful in identifying locations and times that would be appropriate to do outreach in those communities.
All right. If there's not more, I'm going to use assert the privilege of my chair. And I know we have a number of slides left. There are a lot of them in the presentation. My suggestion is you go through the maps fast and get to the point, because we've now been, it's important. We need to understand it because it is a big deal. But I also think we have to take at least a 5-minute courtesy break, and then we will work through till 12:30 and then take a short lunch break. So 5 minutes now, maybe a half hour at 12:30. Okay, so we'll be back in 5 minutes. That just gives you time to get coffee or use the facilities.